World War II is over, and you're doing what?
Well, the day I got out of the Army, the day I came back in New York from being in the Army, I went right to work at the Long Island Press where I had worked before the war. I was a copy boy and semi-reporter in 1942 when I was drafted, but I had done a lot of writing in the Army and public relations, so when I came back they made me a reporter right away at a enlisted salary of $40 a week in 1945. And when my wife heard that when I came home, she said, well, I'm going back to work too. She went back to work as a dental assistant for $25 a week. So believe it or not, on $65 a week, we lived in an apartment in Forest Hills, which was pretty good in those days. Couldn't get a room there these days. But I went right to work, and that was November of 45. And little by little, I started doing everything at the press. I started covering boxing on Monday nights and hockey on Sunday afternoons. When they had the Rovers and the Long Island team in the Jamaica Hall, Sands Point. In fact, I was in the press box at Madison Square Garden one Sunday afternoon, and all of a sudden, in those days there was both Western Union and Postal Telegraph, and all of a sudden, one of the little telegraph keys starts clicking away, and there was a Western Union man named Visconti. That's all I remember. His last name was Visconti, or maybe it was Postal Telegraph, but one of the two. And in the press box at the time were Bill Bridie of the Times, Bob Cook of the Herald Tribune, Kenny Smith of the Mirror, myself, maybe somebody else, but that's just about 4 or 5 of us. It was before the Rovers game, which was the main game of the afternoon, and the telegrapher just said out loud, "Where is Pearl Harbor?" And Bob Cook, a Yale graduate, said, "That's our naval base in Hawaii." And he said, "Oh, the Japanese just bombed it." Well, within an hour, the PA guy at Madison Square Garden was, "Will Lieutenant so-and-so please report to his home base? Will the members of the 34th Fleet please report?" And but later, as the game ended, half the place was empty because all these servicemen that had been coming into the games were going back to their place. But I went in the service and I came out and started working for the press, covering just about everything. But what I had always wanted to do was write baseball, and my sports editor at the time, Mike Lee, managed when the applications came out for membership in the Brooklyn chapter, he put my name in, and about a week before the season opened, I got my first baseball card, baseball writer's card, and I have every one since. I think my number was up in the 400s at that time, and it would be number 1 today, because I'm the oldest active baseball writer still working.
Who covered the Dodgers for the press before you?
The Long Island Press was a burgeoning paper at the time, especially after the war. The circulation got up well over 300,000, because Queens and Long Island were just multiplying. Nobody had covered baseball. They used wire service stories, roundups from AP and UP. But I wanted to write baseball, so I would go down there just about 4 or 5 times a week. I worked in the morning at the press, and at 12 o'clock I would leave, and I'd take 3 trains to get down to Ebbets Field. Take the BMT to Eastern Parkway, take another little train over to Franklin Avenue, get the Franklin Avenue line to Brighton Beach line. And I did that coming and going every day. And I would go down, and what I wound up doing was, in the beginning, doing stories on Long Island players in the major leagues. Mickey Harris with the Red Sox, Bob Chipman with the Cubs, and different players, Sid Gordon. There were a lot of, in those days, there were about 25 Long Islanders in the major leagues, and I would interview them, each one of them. Sam Meal, he was the Red Sox, people like that. And in 1947, I started doing the same thing in spring, while the Dodgers were in spring training. As soon as I came home, I started going to games. And Friday, Mike Lee said to me, the boss said, as long as you go down there every day, he wants you to write a story every day. So that's how I broke in as a daily baseball writer. And I didn't travel in 47. 48, I went down to Vero Beach. The first year Vero Beach was there, because Arthur Mann, who was the publicity director for the Dodgers, knew what I was interested in, the minor league stuff, and they had 500 minor leaguers down there, and I guess there were about 60 from Long Island. So I went down, and I spent a week down in Vero Beach while the Dodgers, the big team, was over in the Dominican Republic. By 1949, the paper said to me, look, you're going to cover them every day, home and around the road. So I went to spring training, 49, with the Dodgers. It was the first time. and then came back north with them and traveled with the team for 1949 until they left in 57, and covered every day. The irony, I thought I always get a kick out. My first year, 1946, I went down, and the first week of the season, Ed Head of the Brooklyn Dodgers pitched a no-hitter against the Boston Braves. And a week later, I was over in Yankee Stadium, and Bob Feller pitched a no-hitter against the Yankees, 1-0. Frankie Pitlock hit a home run to win the game. So in my first week of Major League Baseball, I saw two no-hitters. And I've been fortunate enough to see a total of 13 right now.
But you
I think
still
the
haven't
only
seen a
year...
balk, Jack.
Huh?
You haven't seen a balk yet, though, Jack.
No, I've never seen a balk because people would say to me in the press box, he balked. Did you see it? No, I didn't see it. How come you didn't see it? I said, if you see it, you have to describe it. And I don't know anybody who can describe a balk in one paragraph. So I have never, in all the years that I covered baseball, I have never seen a balk. In fact, they were talking on TV the other night trying to describe it. And how do you describe it? Steve said to somebody. But I think Vince Scully is the only one who's covered more no-hitters. So he's got like 16 by now. But at one time we were tied. And then I covered the Dodgers during those great years when, from 47 I saw Jackie Robinson break in, and then along came Campanella a couple months later and all, and Dan Bankhead. And the Dodgers in 47 wound up in the playoff with the Cardinals. 48 they lost out to the Braves. And 49 they were in the World Series. 50 they lost out on the last day of the season in the 10th inning. 51 they lost out in the third game of a playoff 3 days after the season ended. And then they won in 52, 53, 54 they got beat out. 55 they went all the way, won the World Series. In 56 saw a couple no-hitters that year. Erskine and Magley both pitched no-hitters for the Dodgers. And I played the Yankees again in the World Series. And in 57 they got beat out by the Braves. And I can remember during the 57 season, the Milwaukee Braves were drawing $2 million as a novelty in Milwaukee. It was the old Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee. And I can remember the Braves signed a young catcher from the Chicago area named Hawk Taylor, Bob Hawk Taylor. Mm-hmm. And they gave him a $100,000 bonus. This was before the draft. And I can remember O'Malley saying, we can't compete with a ball club that can give out a $100,000 bonus. We can't continue here. We can't stay here if other ball clubs can give out that kind of money. And of course, they were gone a year later. By the end of the year, they were gone. It was funny the way the announcement of the Brooklyn franchise moving. The Giants came out in August and said they were going to move. They made no bounds about Horace Stoneham, and they were going to Minneapolis. All the girders and all the steelwork for Metropolitan Stadium were on the ground in Minneapolis, anticipating the Giants coming to Minneapolis. But in between the announcement that they were leaving the Polo Grounds and leaving New York, O'Malley talked Horace into moving to San Francisco because the major leagues had told him we can't just have one team on the West Coast. We have to have two. It isn't feasible to go out there for a 3-game series. We got to go out that distance. We got to have at least 2 series to play. And that's when O'Malley started talking about moving. And of course it was 56 and 57 we played 7 games over in Jersey City, which was another indication that he wasn't staying in Brooklyn very long.
The Dodgers moved west inch by inch.
Yeah.
So I think Dick Young's lead was
I know what I wanted to say.
Oh.
The way the announcement was made, the Giants called a press conference to announce it there.
Mm-hmm.
The Dodgers announced their move to California during the Yankee Braves Milwaukee World Series. It was an off day, and we were all in the press room, which in those days was over in the Waldorf Astoria. They used to have the press accommodations in the Waldorf, and then the hospitality was up on the starlight roof of the Waldorf. But they had a big, long suite where all the reporters were working, and all of a sudden, Red Patterson came in, and went over to the bulletin board and put a little note up on the bulletin board, put a pin in it, and walked out. And when we got up to look at the note, it just said, the Brooklyn Dodgers franchise in the National League has been transferred to Los Angeles. That was the way the Dodgers announced their move, which was, rather subtle.
There was but there was a long story here, Jack. I mean, in the mid-50s, I remember O'Malley talking to people in the Wagner administration and trying to get a location in Brooklyn, and he was going to build a dome stadium with his own money.
At the end of the Long Island Railroad Station on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, on Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue, he kept talking about that. Well, it was pie in the sky what O'Malley wanted. O'Malley was no fool, and O'Malley knew that what he was asking for was impossible because it required something similar to what the Mets have been talking about here. It called for a lot of condemnation of land around the Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue. It had to have a lot of demolition of buildings, and the state or the city had to acquire the land and all. O'Malley visioned this as a place where people would come in from Long Island on the Long Island Railroad, and they'd be able to get up out of the stadium, out of the station, walk across the street to the ballpark. It would have been a great place, maybe, but it was impossible because you weren't going to be able to condemn all that land down there and take all that land away from. There was a lot of business in that area that had been there for years. So none of us really took seriously the fact that he wanted to be there. A lot of stuff was written about it, but I don't think anybody seriously believed he could get there. And the second thing was O'Malley did not want, when they built, they were getting the World's Fair ready, and Robert Moses offered him this site where Shea Stadium is now. He's going to build a ballpark for the Dodgers in Flushing Meadow. And O'Malley said, if you move 8 miles, you might as well move 3,000. What he really had in mind was he did not want to be he did not want to be a tenant in any stadium. He wanted to be the landlord. And of course, that's what he did when he moved out to Los Angeles. And I mean, the man was so far ahead of so many other people in baseball. This is a man not many people knew. Besides his law degree from Fordham, he also had an engineering degree from Fordham, and he was the man who did the geodetic survey before they built the Midtown Tunnel. He did the geodetic survey for the feasibility of putting a tunnel under the East River. And when he built the stadium in Los Angeles, who else would think but to build it into a hill? And his theory was, you'll never have to paint it. If you have a stadium that's standing up in the air, you have to paint it every 3 or 4 years. And you know what it costs to paint a stadium? He built it into the hill in Chavez Ravine, and he said he planted, he put a lot of dirt up against it, and he planted palm trees and rhododendrons and everything all around the stadium. So if you go to Dodger Stadium, you go through a garden, botanical garden, before you get into the first gate. He did the same thing in Florida when they were building a spring training stadium, Holman Stadium in Vero Beach. They dug down into the ground and built the stadium down 10, 12 feet below ground level in Vero Beach, which was another way of building a beautiful little stadium without having to ever care for it. Cut the grass, that was it.
Right, that's right. Mow the lawn. In 1946, when you go to Ebbets Field, and you have your writer's card, who's covering the Dodgers? Who was there?
Well,
Who are the writers?
In the morning papers, it was Dick Young, who was the greatest.
Yeah.
Gus Steiger,
Daily Mirror.
morning papers. He was with Daily Mirror. Bob Cook was with the Herald Tribune, and Roscoe McGowan was with the New York Times. For the afternoon papers, it was either Jerry Mitchell or Arch Murray or Sid Friedlander with the Post, Mike Gavin with the Journal American, and Bill Rower with the World Telegram. And he would switch every couple of months with Joe King of the World Telegram. They'd go over to the Giants or the Yankees. But
And you had the Brooklyn Eagle and
the Brooklyn Eagle. Of course, we had the Brooklyn Eagle with the Harold Burr, and the Brooklyn Citizen with Lee Scott, which went out of business in the second year or so. But and then I was the only guy from Long Island there. And then years later, maybe 4 or 5 years later, Newsday started covering too. But that was the basic core. And believe it or not, when the Dodgers left 11 years later, the same writers that worked for those papers that were still alive in those days, the papers, were still there covering. The only change was when Harold Burr fell and broke his hip, he was replaced by Dave Anderson, who worked there the last couple of years. And Dave then went to the Journal and eventually to the Times. But Bill Roeder, Sid Friedlander, Mike Gavin, Dick Young, and Gus Steiger, Roscoe. The Tribune had gone out of business, so the Tribune was gone. But basically, the same writers for those 11 years that I was there, 12 years, and basically, which is unheard of these days, the same ball club.
Right.
I mean, we were it was almost like family with the Dodgers. We not only trained together, we lived together in Florida, and we traveled together, and it was Campanella, Hodges, Robinson, Reese, Cox for many years, Furillo, Snyder, and Preacher, Carl Erskine, Don Newcomb. They spent years looking for a left fielder. They tried, I think, at one point they must have had a dozen guys that tried out in left field. Louis Olmo, Dick Williams, Dick Whitman, there was so many of them. And finally, in June of '51, they made a trade for left fielder. They traded with the Chicago Cubs, and they got Andy Pafko, who was a center fielder in Chicago, and a darn good center fielder in that ballpark. And they got him, and he played left field the last half of '51, which may have been the best team I ever saw because it was an all-star at every position. They had Campy and Hodges, Robinson and Reese. Cox made the all-star team one year. You had Pafko, who was an all-star every year, and Snyder and Furillo. And you had two pitchers like Preacher, Carl Erskine, Don Newcomb, who were on many all-star teams. And it was the best team I ever saw, and they didn't win anything. They lost.
Right. When the Dodger Ball Club, I mean, who was the PR guy? Who were the
well, in the beginning,
manager,
Parrott was the traveling secretary, and then when O'Malley took over the club in 1951, he made Lee Scott the traveling secretary, and Harold was like a business manager, in charge of tickets and all.
Mm-hmm.
The publicity man in the beginning was Alan Roth. Did the statistics. Ricky had brought him in. No club had ever had a statistician before Alan Roth. In fact, he's never been given proper credit. But Alan Roth is the man that created the saves in baseball. When we had Joe Black in 1952, and he was saving so many, he saved 15 and won 15 in '52. And Alan Roth would put out a carbon copy note sheet every day. He had to type it. This was the days before the mimeograph machine and the Xerox machine. He used to have to type his notes twice to have 8 copies to give out. If you got the last one, you could barely read it. But he was first once in his 52 notes started referring to Joe Black has now saved 4 games. Joe Black has now saved 5 games. And the word save gradually came into baseball lexicon. But until he wrote that, now I know other people like Jerome Holtzman and some others have helped to refine the save rule. But Alan Roth was the first one to use the word save for pitchers that came in the 9th inning and got us tied out. Lee Scott became the traveling secretary when his paper went out of business. Publicity was, for a while, we had Frank Graham Jr. was the publicity man. Alan Roth did a lot of publicity. And then Red Patterson had a falling out with George Weiss over in Yankee Stadium, and O'Malley saw it as a coup to bring Patterson over to New York. And we used to kid Patterson because he had all these great promotional ideas. And he had, in September, he decided to call, when the team wasn't doing too well, call it the Back to Books month. And you had to go to the ball game, you got a little souvenir. And then once there was a game that was, I don't know, was played in bad weather or so, and they announced that anybody who had a ticket for that game would be allowed into another game for free. But to get your free ticket, you had to come back and buy a ticket to get into that game, and then you got your free ticket to transfer. So you actually bought 2 tickets to get one free game. But he was a good publicity man. And
he was a sports writer originally.
Yeah, he was originally. He covered the Dodgers back in the early '40s before the war. He covered the Dodgers for the Herald Tribune. He was a baseball writer, and Weiss thought he was a good baseball man. That's why he hired him to be publicity man over at the Yankees. But then he had a falling out over there. Came to the Dodgers. He stayed with the Dodgers up until for many years in Los Angeles, and eventually went over to the Angels. Became the general manager over at the Angels.
There was a press box steward there, and this is kind of far afield.
Benny Weinrich.
Benny Weinrich.
Benny Weinrich.
Exactly.
Right.
Who was one of the few.
Benny Weinrich was a character right out of Brooklyn. You know, you'd see him today in a cartoon or in some TV special. Benny Weinrich always had a shirt and a tie on. He thought it was part of his duty, but the shirt never looked like it had seen the laundry machine for a long time. And Benny had a kind of way of always appearing a little greasy, a little sweaty, you know. And Bill Rhoda used to drive him crazy. Bill Rhoda had a lot of finicky ideas about it. He used to tell Benny, they had a Coke machine down at the end of the press box. They always had Coke and Pepsi. And that wasn't Pepsi, it was only Coke. And Bill Rhoda would call Benny over and he'd say, Benny, would you go down and get me a sarsaparilla or a birch beer or something? He didn't want the Coke. Well, Benny would have to go downstairs, the commissary, get a root beer and bring it up to him. And then Benny would come up and say, Benny, I don't want it out of the bottle. Will you get me a cup? So Benny would have to go downstairs and get cups. It used to drive Benny crazy. But Benny was a fixture in the press box for many years, and he was one of the all-time characters in Brooklyn.
The press room. I mean, they had a press room in Ebbets Field.
The original press room was above the rotunda, which was the big lobby of the hotel, of the ballpark, and it was there that Bill Boylan was the bartender. Bill Boylan was a former minor league pitcher who came home from the minors, couldn't get any further than Albany or someplace like that, and he went to work as a milkman. And he went to work as a milkman in the days when they used horses to draw the milk truck. Mm-hmm. And Bill's work would be done like 10 o'clock in the morning because he'd start delivering at 5. And so he got a job with the Dodgers as batting practice pitcher. And eventually he worked his way up to bartender. So, and the only thing in those days, the bartender had a beer tap and hot dogs. That was the only thing in the press room. And then after the O'Malley started doing things at Ebbets Field, they moved the press room over, and we had a little side room next to it, about half the size of what the original press room was. But after a game, the press room would be crowded with the writers' wives and ball players' friends and O'Malley's friends, and drinking beer and having hot dogs.
There was no real big pregame meal or whatever.
Oh, no. The pregame meals didn't start until, I guess, late in the 50s, early 60s. I remember they always kidded about Kansas City when Charlie Finley owned the club. They had Kentucky Fried Chicken every night for 7 nights a week. And they always had Charlie's favorite oatmeal cookies were always on the table. The meals, I think, started, my recollection, traveling with the club in the 40s and then 50s. The places that started serving hot meals were Cincinnati and Crossley Field, which was a friendly little town, nice little German town, and never had, they only had 2 writers with the ball club. And Gabe Paul and Warren Giles had this little old German lady who came in every afternoon and cooked pot roast dinners or meatloaf dinners. It was one of the great places for writers. And the other one, the best part about that too, is we used to kid about it, was the bartender after the game was an old man named Chuck. And Chuck would let you stay all night long if you wanted. Because his other job was the night watchman. So he'd leave the bar and he'd say, I'll be back in 15 minutes, and he'd take you home. And I can remember talking about the times that bar stayed open so late that one night several of the Boston writers missed their train that was leaving at 1 o'clock in the morning. But Chuck was always there. And the next place that I remember getting hot meals in the press box before the game was Pittsburgh, where they had a couple Negro women his son worked as a bartender, and 2 old ladies. The mother and the daughter did all the cooking, and it was some of the best cooking you ever want to eat. It was great. We loved to go there.
Well, I know when I was a kid, they had press rooms in Chicago, the Bard's Room, Pink Poodle.
Pink Poodle and Boardroom. Right?
Yeah, but I don't ever remember.
They started serving hot meals. When Bill Beck took over in Chicago they started. I think Cleveland also, I didn't travel that league, so I didn't know. Yeah. But I understand they used to say that Cleveland had the best food in the league for writers.
Yes, I remember them saying that, Jack, but I was out of Chicago in 55, so I wasn't.
No, I'm talking about Cleveland.
No, I know
when he was in Cleveland. And, of course, when he came to Chicago, the Bard's Room was already there.
Right.
And he started serving hot food there. Yeah. The Dodgers, for many years, had one of the best press rooms in the league. I don't know I haven't been there lately. The Giants had hot food before the game. You needed it in that cold stadium. I mean, you needed something in your stomach for that.
Yeah, oh, you bet. A Candlestick Park, I'll say.
And what we always liked about Candlestick Park is if you didn't like the food, they always had peanut butter on the table.
Right, right, that's right. But remember, there's no guarantee attached to the heating system. I used to love that notice in the scorecard.
And the Yankees later came around and started serving hot food too.
Mhm.
And when the Mets opened over at the Polo Grounds, they had hot food. Of course, Shea Stadium for years was a fine festival.
Yes, absolutely. One of the best. Yeah.
Completely different now.
Yes, yes. Well, we'll leave that alone.
Yeah. Nobody cares about how sports writers eat.
No, they really don't. In those days, everybody traveled by train.
Oh yeah.
What was that like?
Oh, that was great. I mean, you had to go over to Penn Station on your own. That's why we left from Penn Station with the Dodgers. Only once in a while we'd leave from Grand Central Station if we were going to Boston, because you could get a 1 o'clock train in Boston, be up there by 4 or 5 o'clock, and check into the Kenmore Hotel and go right over to Braves Field. But traveling the trains, I always enjoyed it. I mean, people complained about riding and couldn't sleep on trains and all. I guess I was young and I could sleep, but you got roomettes. In the early days, we had some Pullman car bunk beds. I only had that once or twice. They usually gave the riders roomettes. Players would get upper and lower berths on Pullman cars. The best trip, some of the greatest memories I have go back to 52 and 53 when we left Florida coming north to Barnstorm in the various cities. And we would leave St. Petersburg. The train in those days used to pull up right next to the ballpark. There was a railroad track. And we would leave after playing an exhibition game with the Yankees in the afternoon. We'd get on a train, and the first stop was Jacksonville, where we'd play a game the next day. Well, you stayed overnight in a hotel there. And then we went from Jacksonville to Mobile. Now, on short trips like that, you didn't go to a hotel. If you went to a hotel, they would put 3, 4 guys in a room so they could take a shower the next morning. It was only when we stayed in a town for a day or two that you got a hotel room, and then you shared it with some other writer. And we'd go from Mobile to New Orleans. We usually spent a weekend in New Orleans, which was great. And then started the day-by-day trip up to Chattanooga and Knoxville, places like that. We'd end up in Louisville, and then get on a plane and go over to Washington, where they played their final game of the season in spring training in Washington. But on the trips north, the writers all had their own little roomette, not just a small one, but I mean, you pull a bunk bed down. And they put us all in the final car on the train, which was half a club car and half a Pullman car. And we sit up all night long in that Pullman car, playing cards or drinking, and they had the bar open for us. And Charlie Dresden, when he was a manager, we stopped in all those little southern towns, and Charlie had been a manager in the Southern League before he came up to Cincinnati as a manager. And he knew people in every one of those towns. And every place we went in, there was always some food on a train. New Orleans, I can remember a crate of crawfish being brought up to the platform of the Pullman car at the end. And we went to Nashville for Easter Sunday. I can remember it was a dry state in Tennessee, and you couldn't get anything to drink. But Russ Meyer, who'd been a big pitcher in Nashville, the pitcher Russ Meyer, he knew a place that would get us in. We sat in the kitchen having drinks and dinner, and Russ knew that it was a restaurant where they served food, but in the back in the kitchen we could have a drink. Mm-hmm. And another time, Nashville, was where Fred Russell was the sports editor, and it was a great man, one of the great sports editors of his time.
Yeah, Nashville Banner,
right?
Yeah.
And Freddie always arranged that every time we came to town, there was a bottle of Jack Daniels in our room. Everybody got a bottle of Jack Daniels. We played in Nashville, Tennessee, Nashville, North Carolina, which was a great little city. There were a lot of knitting mills there. And I can remember one year we came through, and they took us out to the knitting mill, and everybody was told, pick out a bolt of cloth that you want and take it with you. We all got a bolt of cloth to take back, and I had suits made for my wife with the beautiful tweed material that they gave us. You were like a traveling circus in those days, coming through the towns. And everywhere we went, it was, because in those days, from 47 on, with Jackie, the mob, all the colored people came out on the afternoon, no matter what day of the week it was. The black people in those towns came out to see Jackie, and of course later Campy and Newcomb and all. One of the towns, I'll never forget the afternoon, we played a weekday afternoon game in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was a typical minor league stadium, and the whole grandstand was cordoned off for white people only, and the bleachers.
About 5, 4, and it's just
1, 2,
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
you can go.
So they opened the gates in Birmingham, and the whole grandstand, all the way down past first base, past third base, are reserved for white people only. The bleachers in left field and right field are for the black people. Well, the bleachers filled up almost immediately. And then little by little, the ropes were moved back in the grandstand. And finally, by the time the game started, there was one little section of white people, and the rest of the park was all black people. I mean, they made their money with the black people, the Negro people in Birmingham, who came out to see Jackie and Campy. And the white people didn't come out, because Birmingham remained that way for a long time.
Oh, yeah. When Jackie first signed with the Dodgers, there was a whole Dixie Walker story here. Dixie Walker was probably the most popular player on the team.
Yeah,
at the
it
time.
started in Cuba when the Dodgers were training in Cuba, and Montreal was there. They had no other team to play, so Ricky brought the Dodgers down to Cuba, and he brought the Montreal team down there too. And they knew that eventually Ricky had plans on bringing Jackie up to the majors, because they would play Montreal and Jackie'd have a good game. And the more the writers saw of Jackie, the more they knew he was a major leaguer, ready for the majors. And finally, they were down in Panama, where they were playing an exhibition series against the Yankees one weekend. And Harold Parrott, who was a traveling secretary, was sitting at the bar with one of the ball players in the hotel they were staying at. And the ball player kind of leaked the news to him that Dixie Walker and Bobby Bragan and a couple of other guys were circulating a petition that if Jackie Robinson was added to the roster, they wouldn't play. They wanted to be traded. And Leo, who was the manager, DeRocha was the manager, this was 46. Harold, as soon as he got wind of it, went upstairs to DeRocha's suite and knocked on his door and told him what was going on. DeRocha got his coaches up and woke up all the ball players and told them to meet him. It was in a army barracks where they met. And Leo came down in his silk pajamas and silk bathrobe, and he read the riot act to those ball. He says, I don't care if he's yellow, pink, black, or whatever color. This guy can help us win ball games, and that's what we want him for. If you guys don't want him, we'll get rid of him. Well, the one guy who insisted all season long that he still wanted to be traded was Dixie, and of course they did trade him after time for the 48. But he played the entire 47 season with Jackie. There was a lot of opposition. There was some people who were stupid and signed the petition, but not many. Pee Wee never signed it. And several other big-name players never signed it. They didn't want any part of this movement. But Dixie and Bobby Bragan did it, and Ricky had just ignored them and brought Jackie up in time for the 47 season. He was added during a weekend a series at home against Montreal, and in 47, and actually played a game in Dodger uniform before the opening of the season. So his first game as a Dodger was not in the opening day, but in like the Saturday afternoon. They played the final exhibition game in Ebbets Field.
There was a whole side story too to this 47th season because of DeRocha's.
Well, DeRocha was banished from baseball by Happy Chandler before the season even started. It's ironical that the day that the Dodgers announced the promotion of Jackie Robinson, the other announcement of the day was that Happy Chandler had banned Leo from baseball for 1 year. And of course, Ricky was livid when he heard, not only did it take his story away from Jackie Robinson, but I mean, he knew that DeRocha was not guilty of any of the things that Happy Chandler was accusing him of. In fact, the one who had first made protests about DeRocha was Larry McPhail. And it all involved some passes that were given in the box seat next to the Dodger dugout to a gambler named Memphis Engelberg. It was a handicapper, really. He wasn't one of those gamblers that took bets. He just was a racetrack character who placed bets and made his living at the racetrack. He had another guy, Connie Engelman, I think was the other man, but Memphis Engelberg was the name. And he wanted to come to this game in Cuba, in Havana, and Patterson, who had given out all the Yankee tickets, managed to get a couple from the Dodgers, and he put them in the Dodger club box next to the dugout. Well, DeRocha, who knew who this guy was, because DeRocha went to the racetrack once in a while, and they captured a picture of him, one of the Daily News photographers captured a picture of him leaning out of the dugout talking to Memphis. With a happy Chandler, that was evidence that Leo was consorting with gamblers. There was no truth to it whatsoever. Patterson testified against, Paul Leo, even though he worked for the Yankees, tried to explain to Chandler what had happened and all. And they had a big hearing at the Sarasota Hotel in which Larry McPhail himself came over and defended DeRocha. And several people defended DeRocha. Some of the writers were called in. And as they left the room, Happy gave Leo a handshake and, okay, buddy, pally, whatever you wanted to call him. And they all left the room thinking everything was clear. About a week later, Happy makes the announcement that he's banning Leo. There was a big movement in Brooklyn in those days by the Brooklyn Tablet, the Catholic newspaper, which was, they had a couple priests there who were opposed to Leo's lifestyle, which was, at the time he was living with Lorraine Day, who was still married, and they weren't married. And Leo also had some unsavory characters that were friends of his, a couple of movie characters and a couple of Broadway gamblers and people like that. I don't think Leo, knowing Leo, if he was going to gamble, would be at the card table. It was not at the racetrack. Leo loved to play cards, and he could beat anybody he played with. But they claimed Leo played in big poker games in the city, and maybe he did, but it never did anything to hamper his baseball playing. I mean, his owner at the time was far more nefarious for his gambling at the racetrack, Larry McPhail.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, you couldn't keep Larry away from the racetracks. I can remember Jack Collins, who was the ticket manager of the Dodgers in those days, telling me later that McPhail was leave for the racetrack at 11 o'clock in the morning. Before he'd come in, he'd come into the ticket office, he'd stick his hand in the till and grab out a bunch of bills and just take off. There was no accounting for what happened to those bills. But Larry was going to the racetrack and needed money. Larry was, quite a character.
Yes, indeed, Larry was quite a character.
Well, he brought Brooklyn out of the doldrums when he came over here in '39, and first thing he did was bring Red Barber into broadcast. Now, there were no broadcasts of ball games in New York before Red Barber was brought in, and he was still doing games in Cincinnati in 1938, which many people will tell you, older people tell you, they remember Red Barber describing Johnny Vandermeer's no-hitter at Ebbets Field, which was his second consecutive no-hitter. But there was no broadcast of that game in Brooklyn. Red was recreating it in Cincinnati.
Right.
So he didn't broadcast that game in Brooklyn, but in '39 he came in and he suddenly, he turned a lot of housewives into baseball fans, because women that were home in the afternoon could turn on the radio and listen to Red Barber with his soothing voice, and he had quite an audience, and they'd be standing there ironing their husband's shirts, and when the husband came home, they could tell him what happened in the ball game, because he was the one they started Ladies' Day in Brooklyn because of him, because there was so many women fans. A lot of women became fans because of Red Barber.
Well, lights, Gladys Gooding.
Yeah, well, Gladys Gooding was the organist there, and of course for years the Mets had Jane Jarvis as the organist here, talking about the Stadium Club here when it opened in '64. They had this woman, Gladys Gooding, who played the organ in the bar room after the game. She played before the game, but after the game, and people would stand around for hours. I can remember walking to the Stadium Club in Shea Stadium hours after I'd finished after the game, and I'd finished my story, and they'd still be 2-3 deep at the bar, drinking beer and drinking and listening to Jane Jarvis on the organ. Yeah.
Yeah, it's but Gladys Gooding.
Gladys Gooding was famous in Brooklyn because.
Well, she was actually the organist at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But she was the trivia question, right?
Exactly, but she started at the Garden.
Yeah.
The Garden had hired her.
And then I guess
McPhail heard her at the Garden.
Yeah.
Right.
What was the famous trivia question? Who played for the Rangers and the Dodgers?
Who played for the Knicks, the Rangers, and the Dodgers in the same season?
That was
Gladys Gooding. That's right. That's exactly. Yeah, I'd forgotten that, but that's right. It was the Knicks, the Rangers.
That was
the
a,
Dodgers,
just being.
right.
They were
Right.
always trying to stump people on the radio. Who played for?
Right. That's right. You're right. At one time, that was a big.
And everybody,
big, yeah.
and most people misspelled her name because she spelled her name with two
O's.
D's. Two D's.
Two D's and two O's.
Two,
Right.
two O's and two D's.
Yep,
It was
yep.
good ding.
Yep. Yep. And
It was a great
she
gal.
was originally from Missouri, but I think she was a teacher in New York or something, and she got hired by the Garden to play the national anthem,
Yeah.
and then eventually
Stayed
expanded
on.
the repertoire, you know, and turned out to have a pretty good sense of how to what to play during games, you know, hockey games or
Well, of
whatever.
course, you know, the night that she played the last game in Ebbets Field, she played nothing but sad songs.
Right.
You know, and
California, here we come. I
yeah,
think
that was the end. You know.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But all night long, it said "Good Night, Sweetheart," and Old Lang Syne,
Mhm,
songs like that.
Mhm.
But getting back to the Dodgers in the years that I covered them, from 46 through 57 when I left, what I said, I think, before was that it was basically the same team year in and year out.
Mhm.
And, you know, they would add a player here. He'd go to spring training, and all they were looking for was a fourth or fifth starter or an outfielder or another infielder. One of the biggest jokes we had going was the list of names of shortstops that Pee Wee Reese kept out of baseball. There were about 12 good shortstops in the Dodger farm system
Sure.
that didn't make it with the Dodgers because of Pee Wee Reese did,
Right.
but they wound up with other ball clubs.
Right. They've started with other teams,
Yeah.
Fernandez,
Yeah.
Morgan, guys like that. Yeah.
Oh, Bobby Morgan, Chico Hernandez, Eddie Mixes, the list goes on and on. They were looking for a third baseman, and they made the deal for Ransom Jackson, Randy Jackson. But the left field was always a big open spot until they finally got Pafko. He came over in June of '51, and he played the last half of the season. And then he played 52 and had a pretty good season. I think he hit in the 280s or so. And then they traded him, and now they're back to where they were before they got the deal. They're still looking for a third baseman.
I never figured that out. I mean, they had a left fielder, and then they swapped him away. And they went to Milwaukee, if I remember.
But if you remember that from '47, we were in the race every year except '48. They got eliminated like about a week or so before the end of the season.
Right.
And '54, they lost out too.
Well, yeah, but 50 in 1950.
54 was the Giants' great team that won.
Well, the 54 Giants, yeah.
Yeah, they wound up sweeping the
they-
Indians in the World Series.
And they pretty much controlled the race.
But
yeah,
I mean,
right.
it was an exciting team to cover because in many National League cities where the Dodgers went in, it was like the Yankees coming in. They had a team of sluggers. They
Sure.
had pretty good pitchers.
Mhm.
They always had until Olson had a very colorful manager. Olson was kind of quiet, but he was a good manager, you know. But it was an exciting team to cover. It was not.
What's your
maybe one of
favorite
the-
Chuck Dressen story?
My favorite Chuck Dressen story, just had a recall it from my friend Buzzy Bevrezi recently. I'll never forget, we had a pitcher named Irv Palika, and Charlie thought he was too timid. He wasn't tough enough for Charlie. And Palika came in, and Palika was a guy, he had 12 different pitches. If you told him how to throw a knuckleball in the morning, by the afternoon he'd have it perfected. He could throw in the high 80s, great curveball, and there wasn't any pitch he couldn't throw. The only trouble was he didn't throw the good ones often enough. He didn't. But he had this one game that he blew a game after one afternoon in Ebbets Field, and in the clubhouse in Charlie's office after the game, he's ranting and raving. That gutless little pit, that gutless, there's no guts. He doesn't belong in the major leagues. They told me he could win 12 games for me. I can't win 2 games for me. And the next day, we all had headlines in the afternoon papers. Dressen bans Palika gutless. Oh, God. Bevrezi was furious. He wanted to ban all the writers from the press box. He had to call the commissioner and tell him that you can't do that, Buzzy. And Buzzy had been there all the time that Charlie was popping off. Oh, Charlie was a very, very colorful guy. He really was. I mean, he wasn't as good a manager as he thought he was. I mean, as the players would tell you later, they'd be losing in the 8th inning by 2 runs, and Charlie would say, just keep them close. I'll think of something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
He used to coach third base sometimes.
Huh?
He used to
Well,
coach
he
third
was
base.
originally when, huh? Yeah, the whistle. When Charlie first joined the Dodgers, DeRocher was the manager, and Dressen had been the manager from McPhail in Cincinnati. So when he made DeRocher the manager, he wanted DeRocher to bring Charlie in as his assistant because he knew that Charlie had managed and knew the league. And Dressen had no objection to it because he didn't think Dressen was any kind of a threat to him. And Charlie coached third base, and he was very popular over there. Between him and the guy that was Cookie's fan and sent balloons up every time Cookie Lavagetto, there was a restaurant, some restaurateur, I forget his name right now, but he used to holler Cookie, and he had a little compressor, and he would blow up balloons, and he'd send them up every time Cookie Lavagetto came up to bat. But the whole place, Ebbets Field was full of characters. And Charlie had characters of his own. He had Red, the florist, who would wind up sending a big horseshoe wreath on opening day. And he had another guy who was Jerry Ray, who was a stockbroker who also owned the White Turkey Farm up in Connecticut. And these hangers-on with him were, it was like a traveling circus, really. They'd go on the road with us. And Charlie always considered himself an epicure, and he would take us, a gourmand, he would take us to the restaurants, and he had to order what Charlie wanted you to order. But Charlie was running the show.
In 1947, after DeRocher, this is like this tumultuous Saturday.
Right.
DeRocher is banned for the year.
It happened on a Friday.
Or Friday,
Yeah.
right.
The announcements came on a Friday.
Right. What happened then? You got to play the
Well,
game.
now, Clyde Sukforth, who was the catching coach and one of DeRocher's trusted aides, he had to take over the team for the first three games of the season, while Ricky got in touch with his old friend Bert Schotten and took him out of retirement. Schotten was living down in Florida, Bartow, Florida, and he brought Schotten out of retirement. Schotten had managed in the Phillies in the 30s, but he was an old friend of Ricky's from the Cardinal days. He brought him in, and Schotten won the pennant in '47. It was Schotten who eventually led to DeRocher going to the Giants in '51 because, 48, I mean. When the Giants got off to a bad start in '48, Horace Stoneham called Ricky and asked him if he could negotiate with Schotten to take over his ball club. He wanted to fire Mel out and bring in Schotten, who had won a pennant that one year in Brooklyn. And Ricky said to him, well, I won't let you talk to Schotten, but you can have DeRocher if you want him. Well, DeRocher was managing the diet. Ricky wanted to get rid of DeRocher because DeRocher was now heavily tied up with the Hollywood crowd and with Lorraine Day, and he didn't pay much attention in spring training in '48. So Ricky wanted to get rid of him. So with Bill Corum, the sports editor of the Journal, as Leo's advocate, it was his agent, I guess he'd grown. He negotiated with Horace, and after 2 or 3 days, Leo went over to the Giants, and Schotten came back and married the Dodgers. And that's how in '47 they were. 48. Where am I? I'm sorry.
1948.
48. That's
that
what
was.
he,
But that was the
no,
big,
that wasn't the year they won, but then they won again in '49.
the biggest story of
Oh,
the year.
of course. Oh, I remember working in the press. I was at the Long Island Press the morning the announcement was made, and was going to the game that afternoon, and somebody called into the office and said, there's a story on the radio that DeRocher has left the Dodgers. He's going to manage the Giants. And I can remember us telling him, go back and have another drink. This was 10 o'clock in the morning, and of course it hadn't hit the radio because Bill Corum had the story on the front page. He had the exclusive, and the Journal just hit the streets around 10 o'clock in the morning. And it wasn't until like a half an hour later the AP came over the machines and it was announced, and then they called a press conference later, and the whole thing was announced.
Yeah, I remember that was a sensation.
It was at the All-Star break.
Yeah.
DeRocher had gone up to Montreal to look at some farmhands up there that they were thinking of bringing somebody up because the Dodgers were struggling. And when he got up before he even got out to a ballpark, Branch Rickey Jr., who was up there, said, my dad wants you to come back to Brooklyn. He's got to talk to you. By the time he came back, Leo had heard from Corum, and the deal was completed. And of course, they hated Leo for leaving in Brooklyn, and they hated Leo in the Polo Grounds, where he was
Right.
the rival manager from Brooklyn. Took him a little while to be accepted over in the Polo Grounds.
Well, a couple of pennants later, they were happy.
Oh, very happy. And eventually he wore out his welcome there too.
Yeah. Branch Rickey, what was he like? You hear a lot of stories about Branch Rickey. You know.
If you would give me 2 minutes to go to the bathroom, I would be happy.
You got it.
Can you stand
Okay.
Rickey?
Good.
Um,
Yeah, Branch Rickey.
Well, you know, I'd heard of Rickey for all those years in St. Louis when he had the Cardinal Chain Gang and the big farm system and all. When he came to Brooklyn, in 42, Larry McPhail, who had run the club since 39, at the request of the Brooklyn Trust Company, he went back into service, and the Brooklyn Trust Company brought Branch Rickey in service general manager while Larry is away in the service, because they gave Rickey 25% of the stock to come in, which later became the famous story with Walter O'Malley. But Rickey came to Brooklyn, and the war was in progress in 42. And one of the first things he did was have a meeting with all his scouts all over the country. I don't know whether he called them in or wrote to them. He said, I want you to sign, I want you to sign anybody that you see that looks like he can play ball, can throw, catch, run, anybody looks like he has a chance to be a ball player. And the scouts said, but a lot of these 16, 17, 18-year-old kids will be going into the service. He said, I don't care. He says, give them $100 each. He said, they'd be glad to get $100 right now. And he said, they go into the service, fine. He said, they come back, they can still play fine. If they can't, we only spend $100. Well, when the war was over, Rickey had a spring training camp at Sanford, Florida. He had 600 ball players there. He had cornered the market on young ball players, and that was the beginning of the Brooklyn Dodger dynasty. I can remember when I went to Vero Beach in 48, there still were about 500 ball players in the system. In Sanford in 1946, the training camp, it was an old naval base, so there was plenty of place for the kids to sleep and eat in the cafeterias and all. But there were so many ball players that they numbered them 1 to 100 in different colors. There were uniforms with green numbers, there were blue numbers, there were yellow numbers, there were red numbers. He had 600 ball players. And of course, out of that 600, he got some pretty good ball players. He had Carl Frillo, he had Duke Snyder, he had a catcher named Ferrell Anderson, he had several pitchers. And but in those days, he needed all those ball players because nowadays you have a farm system with 3 or 4 ball clubs. In 1948, the Brooklyn Dodgers had 28 farm teams. There were 52 leagues in America in those days. If you look at the record book, it was that thick. There were so many leagues. But Rickey had 28 farm clubs. The Dodgers had all those ball players.
Yeah, and they stocked them all.
And he stocked them, and he sold them off. A typical Rickey with all his ball players and all the players he had, in 1948, I guess, or 49, he was trying to get a pitcher that he'd had in St. Louis named Bill Worley, who was now with the left-hander, who was now with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And he offered Roy Hamey, who was the general manager of the Pirates, he offered him $250,000 with Bill Worley. He wanted him as a reliever. And Hamey was all set to take the deal until Rickey said, well, now, you can have Bud Parbelian, he's worth $50,000. You can have this guy who's worth $50,000. He was going to give him 5 ball players that he valued at $50,000 apiece, and said, that's $250,000. There wasn't any cash going to go back and forth.
Well, I know it was that Rickey had a nickname of which he was not particularly fond, which was El Cheapo.
Well, that was Jimmy Powers in the Daily News gave him that name. And somebody else gave him the nickname Mahatma because he was the lord of all of baseball. You know. He was the greatest innovator that I ever saw. I mean, he did things in baseball. He had, in spring training, he would set up what they called the strings. And he'd have 2 poles, and they'd have string across the bottom, across the top, and then down the middle. And in that square part was the exact area that they talk about the strike zone nowadays. That was the strike zone. And if you hit the outside string, it wasn't a strike. Nowadays, it's a strike. But he would sit there in a director's chair while he had a young pitcher throwing into the strings and all. And he had his secretary, Mary Jane, sitting next to him. And he would ask the player all kinds of questions. Family security meant a lot to Rickey because he felt a player who was married would not be running around when he was on the road. And he would say, are you married? Do you have a girlfriend? I mean, while the guy's throwing, he's asking these personal questions, and Mary Jane is copying it all down. He had a regular. And every night in spring training, after dinner, in the old theater that was the Navy theater, the Vero Beach was a Navy training base during the war. He would hold a lecture every night for about an hour and a half, in which he would point out different plays, how to handle certain things, and fascinating. It was like a college of baseball down there. In fact, that's Ricky's College is what a lot of people called it. But it was a great place to be in spring training in '49 and '50 with those young Dodger teams and that would go on and become so dominant in the National League. And he brought all the writers down there. We lived in Navy barracks, and he brought all the writers down there and said, "Now, I can't get you hotel rooms, but," he said, "I can take you and your family one of our suites here." I had one. Across the hall from me was Roy Campanella and his wife and a young Roy Jr. And my wife and I had a baby at the time. And because the dining room wasn't big enough, the ball player, this was when the major leaguers were there, it was set up like a regular hotel dining room, white tablecloths. In fact, Stevens catered all the food. Harry M. Stevens catered the dinner, 3 meals a day. And the ball players ate first at 5 o'clock, from 5 until 6:30, or 7 o'clock. And the writers, he would set up a press room in the back where we could work, but also was like a cocktail lounge. And so 5 o'clock at night, it opened up for cocktails for the writers and their wives and baseball club officials. And then at 7:30, we were allowed to go into the dining room because now the players have it. And it was just, one big happy family. We ate with the players. I mean, we lived with the players. The players' wives sat around the pool all day long with the writers' wives. They built a swimming pool just for that. And there were shuffleboard courts and tennis courts. But we became very friendly. My wife became very friendly with other players' wives, and writers' wives. It was like going on a vacation with a bunch of friends.
How come Ricky got squeezed out? What happened?
Well, O'Malley was coming in. He and O'Malley didn't get along at all. I mean, and O'Malley. The funny thing is, when the Brooklyn Trust Company brought Ricky in, they also brought in someone to watch the store for them because they held the mortgage on Ebbets Field and the Dodger and the baseball ball club. And they gave Jim Mulvey, who's married Deary McKeever, whose father was one of the original owners of the Dodgers, Judge McKeever, when it was McKeever and Ebbets Corporation back into the 20s. Brooklyn Trust Company had 2 young lawyers, law clerks working for them, both out of college, and they decided they wanted to send one out to Ebbets Field to work at the ball club of Montague Street, the club offices. The 2 officers, the 2 young lawyers, one was Walter O'Malley, and the other one was William Shea, Bill Shea. And so it could easily have been Shea to take up, but instead it was O'Malley. And eventually, with some friends, he bought, I think it was for $250,000, he bought 25% of the club. And Ricky had 25% of the club given to him as part of his salary for taking over. Deary Mulvey owned the other 25. And another 25 was owned by a very good friend of O'Malley's, John L. Smith, who owned the Pfizer Chemical Company.
Oh, yeah,
He
pharmaceuticals.
was a very, very good friend. Of course, that penicillin had just come in those days, but during the war. And of course, Pfizer stock was worth a fortune. John L. Smith used to come around Ebbets Field quite a bit. He was a baseball fan, but he was a good friend of O'Malley. Eventually, when he died, O'Malley bought his 25% from May Smith, the widow. How much he paid, I don't know, but at least now he had 50%. But he still had Ricky and Mulvey, who also owned 50%. So he wanted to get Ricky out of the scene. Mulvey he could handle it, only had 25%, but if he got Ricky Mulvey wasn't going to sell anyway. The Mulvey stock wasn't sold until many years later in Los Angeles when Deary Mulvey, the wife, and Jim Mulvey, the husband, who was a big man with the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, they both died in the same year, and the family had to sell the stock to avoid big taxes. But in 1950, O'Malley made a pitch for Ricky's stock, and of course Ricky was going to do whatever he can to hurt O'Malley because they couldn't stand each other. See, O'Malley was always watching the purse strings at Ebbets Field, and Ricky didn't like that, because Ricky wanted to be in charge. So finally he said, I'll sell you my 25% for $1 million, $1,050,000. What it was that anybody selling their stock had to give one of the other members, one of the other owners, the right of first refusal. So when Ricky wanted to buy, he said, what's the best offer I can get for my stock? He went to a friend of his, William Zeckendorf, who was a big real estate operator here in New York. And he got, when O'Malley offered $1 million for the stock, 25% more, which would have then given him 75%, Ricky said, well, I can get $1,050,000. And he had gotten Zeckendorf. He had to write a separate check for $50,000 to give to Zeckendorf. And Ricky, for many years, carried that check around in his wallet to show how he got. You didn't often outdo Ricky, O'Malley, but Ricky managed to one up in that one. And of course, Ricky was only out of baseball for a couple of months when he went to Pittsburgh, where his friend John Galbraith was multimillionaire, owned the Pirates, or was principal owner of the Pirates, and he brought Ricky in to run the Pirates.
Right, and eventually built the winner there, too.
He built a winner there, too. It took a little longer, but he built a winner there, too.
Some of it was Dodger talent, like Roberto Clemente.
Oh, yeah, well, that, the Dodgers tried to hide him. They had him up in Montreal, but they wouldn't play him.